Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister and asks, did he meet with Warner Brothers and New Line movie executives in Los Angeles and with United States Trade Representative Ambassador Ron Kirk, who is responsible for US intellectual property and privacy matters, in the middle of last year? If so, on what dates?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I had dinner with Warner Brothers and New Line movie executives on the 18th of July 2011 and met with US Trade Representative Ambassador Ron Kirk on 22nd of July. It's a little misleading to suggest that the Office of the US Trade Representative is, quote, responsible for US intellectual property and piracy matters. It's one of a significant number of US agencies which have input into intellectual property policy and enforcement in the United States. These include the United States Copyright Office, the US Patent and Trademark Office, the Department of Commerce Office of Intellectual Property Rights, the US Department of State Offices of International Intellectual Property Enforcement, the National Intelligence...
Point of order, Charles Chauvel. Order. A point of order has been called. Charles Chauvel.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. I think the Prime Minister substantially answered the question. I'm not interested in a list of other US agencies.
Well, order. The member would have been wise perhaps not to include an unnecessary phrase in his primary question. And I'll hear Charles Chauvel.
The primary question ascribed responsibility to the US Trade Representative for a particular matter. There is no doubt that he has responsibility for that matter. The fact that other agencies also have that responsibility is neither here nor there.
Well, since the member does more or less challenge me, if the member checks standing orders, that phrase being allowed in the question was very marginal because it's absolutely unnecessary for the question, absolutely unnecessary for the meaning of the primary question, and that's why the Prime Minister, I'm sure, latched onto it, and it's just a lesson in why the standing order is worded the way it is. Charles Chauvel, supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At any of those meetings, either on the 18th or the 22nd of July, was there any discussion of the United States government's so-called review of notorious markets, whose purpose is to identify economies that fail to deal adequately with intellectual property infringements?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm almost certain that's no. It was certainly no in the case of the Warner Brothers meeting, and in terms of the meeting that we had with Ron Kirk. There was a wide-ranging discussion there. We did talk a little about Trans-Pacific Partnership. We did talk about, in relation to that agreement, upholding strong intellectual property frameworks, and the only time the issue of piracy was raised was actually raised by Ambassador Mike Moore, who briefed Ambassador Kirk on the new copyright legislation which had been introduced to New Zealand.
Clare Curran.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the Prime Minister, before he went on that trip, did the Attorney-General discuss with him his recent trip to an Attorneys General conference in Australia, a conference which focused on cybercrime and where the Attorney-General spoke specifically on extradition?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very saddened to say this. No, he didn't. It would have been a fascinating trip, and I love my engagements with Chris as he talks to me about his international travels. I wish he'd done it because I would have listened very carefully.
Clare Curran. Clare Curran, order.
To the Prime Minister, did the then Commerce and Justice Minister Simon Power discuss intellectual property issues and his meeting with the Asian Pacific head of the Motion Picture Association, Mike Ellis, with him before or after he went on his US trip?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
No, and at the risk of offending a colleague who's now left, can I say also I thoroughly enjoyed my conversations I had with Simon Power on a range of issues, but this wasn't one of them.
Question number 12, Chris Ochenwald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.